Well, welcome everyone to the inaugural episode of Threat Modeling Unleashed. My name is Bruce Warren, and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Security Compass, and I'll be your host today. And joining me on the podcast is Chris Romeo, the Vice President of Devici at Security Compass. Chris is a lifelong cybersecurity professional focusing on application security and threat modeling. Chris has held many roles from trusted product evaluator, senior security consultant, pen tester, director of incident response, chief security advocate at Cisco, and startup CEO at Security Journey before he founded Devici. He's also a co-author of the Threat Modeling Manifesto and has been threat modeling for over 25 years. So he brings a wealth of experience to this conversation. And we started this podcast to help educate security leaders and developers on modern threat modeling, which is really grounded in real world practices. And Chris has a lot of experience doing that, as you heard. And in the podcast, we're going to talk about challenges with current threat modeling solutions and provide best practices for evolving your threat modeling in the current AppSec environment. And lastly, we really want to encourage people to adopt security by design principles and to use threat modeling as a critical component of making that a reality. So I'm really excited to introduce this podcast to you. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about getting started with threat modeling. So, Chris, I'll start off with a question. I think a lot of companies that we've talked to may be somewhat overwhelmed about launching a threat modeling initiative. What are some tips for companies that are just getting started with threat modeling?
Yeah, and I have to comment first on the lifelong cybersecurity professional. I love that, and I was trying to think when I started in cybersecurity. It's been lifelong, but I think it was maybe in my teens. It's probably getting into more trouble around
Oh,
that time, and then made my way forward. But a lot of cybersecurity people did that in the early days. But yeah, great question on for folks getting started, because this can be a daunting thing to try to get some traction with inside of companies. And I would say a couple different tips for people getting started with this. One tip is just on the education front. Finding some solid resources to get an understanding. And there's a number of different books out there that folks have written. A couple friends of mine, Izar Tarandosh, Matt Coles, have written a great threat modeling book that's kind of gives a lot of perspective on a lot of different angles. And certainly Adam Shostak's written a number of different books as well. Um, and so the education piece is a great place to start as far as learning what is threat modeling, what are some different ways you can approach it. And then you mentioned the threat modeling manifesto as well. That can be a great resource for folks getting started, because it's designed to be simple, but give you the essence of threat modeling so you can understand it better. I think other tips for folks that are getting started, I would say keep it simple in the early days. Don't try to overcomplicate this threat modeling process, because it can be very complicated. We can get so down in the weeds that we never get any value out of the process and the things that we're doing modeling upon. So I like to use in-person experiences in the early days of getting threat modeling rolling. And so what I mean by that is, let's get a group of people in a room, which is, can be a virtual room in these days. And when I was doing this in the early days, it was a physical room where we had whiteboards and stuff. But get people into a physical room, spend a little bit of time educating them about threat modeling, and then just pick some silly examples that you could do a threat model. I start with a cottage example. I put up a picture of an English cottage with a fence around it, and I say, okay, and I split people into teams, and I say, okay, figure out what are the different interfaces that you could use to break into that cottage and steal the world's best piece of chocolate cake. And people chuckle. They think they get that type of response, but then they go to work and they start analyzing the cottage. They go, okay, there's windows, there's a straw roof, there's a tree next to it. And then from that example, I make my way into a home alarm system as the next one it has some technology components in it, like an app and things, but also some physical things like windows and sensors on windows. And I let them tear that apart, figure out, okay, then I move to what are the threats against this? And then what are some thoughts on how you would mitigate those? And then my third example is tied to whatever technology that they're working within. So it might be just a web app with more detail about the pieces and components that make it up. But threat modeling is something that's very experiential. I can lecture on it for 40 hours and I'll love it. I'll enjoy the whole time. But at the end of the day, if all I do is lecture on, people don't get better at threat modeling. So you gotta get reps. And so we get those reps early with the kind of different types of examples that I shared. And we just have to acknowledge in the beginning when people are creating threat models, they're not going to be great. They're not going to be things we want to publish and show. That's okay because it's a process and you get better the more experience you have doing it. So I think I gave a couple of different tips that folks can hopefully put into action there to get this threat modeling thing rolling.
Yeah, that's great, Chris. And I can definitely, as a lover of chocolate cake, I can definitely relate to doing everything I can to prevent the threats so we can get in that chocolate cake. That's
You
great.
want to know what the best I there's always one statement that somebody will make when I do that exercise that I've never heard before. One of my favorite ones is somebody said they were going to dress up as Santa Claus and knock on the door and just ask for the piece of cake.
Oh, that's
I mean, but that's the creative thinking process I want people to be. I want them to be thinking about, this problem, and it's a fun way to get them introduced to threat modeling.
Yeah, and I think, Chris, you make a good point about just getting started with it. I think some companies and people are like nervous about not doing it perfectly, but you raised a good point that you just got to learn by doing. Just start doing it. It's very experiential. Get in there, get your hands dirty. You're going to learn a lot from that, just like in everything. Uh, for teams that are just starting out with a threat modeling program, who do you think should be at the table for that? Like, what's the best practice around who you get involved in building and refining a threat model?
So we talked about this in the threat modeling manifesto, the value of having diverse perspectives come to the table in the threat modeling process. So if I got to choose exactly who was coming to the table, I like to have representatives from the development team, testing teams if we have it. Some people have testing teams still. Some people are full DevOps with testing fully integrated. But in that case, I might want a DevOps engineer to join the conversation as well. I like to have a product manager there. And I'm stacking up this, and then somebody from security as well. It might be me, might be somebody else. The reason I'm stacking this group up the way I am is because each of these functions has a different view of the thing that we're building. I have seen heard some insights from product managers where I just go, I'm a security person. I just don't think that way. But they think about the threats to the thing that's being built differently than I do as a security person, different from the developer who's going to actually write the code and build the thing. And so it's important to have a distribution of different thinkers and people that have had different experiences that can all come together and consider what the threats and the mitigations are, because that's where you get a lot of value. You don't want to just have all developers at the table. I mean, you can do it that way, you will get some value out of it, but you won't get the value if you have a very broad distribution of backgrounds and experience all working together towards, let's figure out what are the major threats and the mitigations for how we're going to fix them.
Yeah, that's good. You really want to encourage a diversity of thought when you're putting that together. Get different people's opinions, and you'll come up with a lot of new stuff. Flip side to that question: is there anyone that really shouldn't be involved at this stage, or that people you want to maybe bring in later but don't want them there right at the beginning?
I mean, I'm a firm believer that anybody who wants to be in the threat modeling process, I'll bring them to the table.
Even
Everybody
marketing,
adds
Chris?
value,
Yep.
even marketing. Marketing people, just like product managers, you see the product differently than I do. And
Right.
that's the real value proposition is we don't just want to think about this from the security experience perspective. We want to be thinking about how the customer is going to interact with the product. And yes, that's mostly the product manager. Marketing folks tend to think more customer centric than I do as a security person. And so, yeah, there is nobody that I don't want at the table. I want anybody that, if anybody, especially if they raise their hand and go, that sounds kind of interesting. Can I be a part of it? Anybody that does that, come on in. Now we're talking about security champions and building that community there. But everybody can add value in this process.
That's a good point. Next question is around, I think a lot of companies are struggling with the pressure to release software faster and faster. And like, you want to get this threat modeling done, get it up quickly. How do you get executive and developer buy-in without slowing down the pace of delivery?
Those are two very different questions hidden within there, right? Executive buy-in and developer buy-in, in my mind, are two very different
We talk about
conversations.
those
And
separately. Yeah.
yeah, they're different ways. Let's talk about the executive side first. We have to consider that executives see the world differently, right? Executives tend to understand risk, they understand costs, they understand profit, and the fact that we're making money ultimately from any of these actions that we're doing, and return on investment. They think from a return on investment perspective. So if you're going to an executive or a group of executives to say, I'd like to do this threat modeling program, and I'd like you to be the executive champion for me, you have to go with return on investment information. That's the language that they speak, and that's how they think about the things that they're a part of. And so how do you get some data from that? Well, proof of concept works in the threat modeling space too. So get a couple of different teams, take them through an exercise like what I described there, about a training exercise in doing threat modeling, and then have them do some threat modeling of specific features or user stories in the things that they're building, and then collect data on that. Highlight the number of threats that you were able to mitigate in the threat modeling process. That's the key metric, because if you don't do threat modeling, the mitigations that you miss out on, if you didn't do it, that becomes the rework value. That's what the development teams and ultimately everybody that's part of the product lifecycle, that's what everybody has to cycle back and fix if we find those things after we release and we skip threat modeling. And so that's the data from the executive perspective that we need to be able to calculate and demonstrate. If we do threat modeling, and here's two teams that we did it with, they found 10 things that they were able to mitigate during the design phase. That would have cost us, we can estimate that would have cost us $200,000 if we would have had to go around and rework by the time we get done with paying for the developers to fix it, paying for what it costs us. I mean, every time we release a piece of software, it has a cost associated with it. And that's how executives are thinking. Customer we have to distribute to customers. They have to load a new version of software, whatever. If we're not in a SaaS, if we're in a SaaS world, they're just refreshing. But if you're in a product world where there's some software release that comes a part of it, that has a cost as well. And if you release a new version of software every week or every day that someone has to update, there's a reputational cost that goes with that too. So it's about packaging that up, and I'm throwing a number of different things at the wall, and ultimately some of them will stick for different audiences because some of this is based on your environment and your culture. But find the right way to make a business case is where I'm ultimately landing. Make a business case for threat modeling based on a small subset of data that you collect. That's the executive side. We go over to talking with developers or trying to influence developers about the value of threat modeling. What I found in my travels of 25 plus years in tech, very seldom have I found a developer who wants to create something terrible or build something terrible. They tend to have pride in the things that they build and the solutions they put forward. And so that's the angle that I think we need to express and help them to understand. Threat modeling is going to, it's going to limit rework for you, which developers though, they hate rework. There's nothing worse than being a month down the road and then having to circle back and offload all the things they were working on and reload in their brain all of the context for what they were thinking a month ago with this feature that to them is old now, and then having to remember all the things they were working on and then try to fix the problem that was identified. So that's one.
The context switching is expensive, and also developers want to write new stuff, right? They're not so keen on going back and like revisiting the stuff.
Yeah. So it's about helping them to understand that doing the threat modeling process while they're designing, and everybody designs something. People will tell me, "Oh, we don't design things." That's ridiculous. It may be on a scratch piece of paper or a whiteboard, but very seldom do you start with a new feature with no design behind it. So there is a design. Somebody has to have the idea and process how we're going to do it. So being able to show them, one, threat modeling helps you create things that are more excellent and just better quality. And two, this is going to help you spend less time circling back on things from previous sprints that you thought had already been released and were no longer things you were going to be worried about. So those are the two angles I'd like to share with developers. And I don't feel like I'm not misleading them to try to get to the threat model. I'm just showing them that there's value in going through this process above and beyond the creation of the threat model. It's going to be less work for them. It's going to be allow them to create better things. And so that's the tact I take with them.
Yeah, that's good. And I think your talk track around the cost of rework is also a good one for executives, because that context switching is expensive. They got to go back. First, you got to pull them off the new stuff they're building. You got to go back and do all that rework. They have to switch context, but it's the opportunity cost as well. About they're not spending that time developing new stuff, which is the revenue argument, right?
Yeah,
it's good. What are some practical first steps a team can make to really make threat modeling repeatable and not just like creating a one-off diagram that people don't use?
I like to build a process very early. If I'm a leader who's been tasked with creating a bigger threat modeling process that the company's going to use, or a program, let's say, I like to identify what the process is going to be very early. Now, it doesn't guarantee that's going to be what the process looks like 6 months from now, but I want to have an artifact that describes how we approach this threat modeling thing. And some of it will be dependent on that particular organization, just because you may have access to certain drawing tools, for example, that lead you down a path of saying, in the early days, we're going to start with data flow diagrams and we're going to use this free drawing tool, or we have a subscription to this other thing. We're going to create our threat models there. So in the early days, it becomes about in making sure things are repeatable. It's about how do we identify that process and then describe it in such a way that people can reference it, knowing that we're going to iterate on it over time. It's not going to be perfect from the beginning, but at least having something versus just going in and describing to people, we're doing this threat modeling thing. Here we go. Have fun. They've got something, a point of reference that they can look back towards and see. Hopefully they'll see some of the value in understanding how the process works, but they also have something that as this starts to fan out and reach other teams, there's something that there's a North Star, I guess, in the threat modeling program, which is here's the process for how we do this.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. What are some mistakes that teams make when they start a threat modeling program? What have you seen?
How much time do you have? Yeah, no, I mean, some mistakes that I see people make. One, I would say kind of threat modeling becomes a compliance activity. Like for me, that's a bad word. Like I get compliance and where it fits into the world, but threat modeling should be a value creation tool, not something that we just check the box. And so I've seen it, unfortunately, be considered a check the box thing by developers. So they don't put any effort into it. They just put the minimum amount of effort to check the box and say, send this thing out on its way. So I'd say that's a mistake, is letting that become the culture, because that's hard to back out of. Once that train leaves the station, it's hard to change the course. If you have that kind of, this is just a busy work, checkbox compliance type of thing, and just do it and they'll leave you alone. Like, no, we want this to be a value creator that people use to architect the entire system that they're building. And it becomes a valuable artifact that they can reference when they're like new people are looking at the product. Okay, well, take a look at this threat model, because you'll understand how everything fits together in how we've built this thing. So that's one mistake. Let's say another mistake is trying to automate before you understand threat modeling. So, and that can be, adopting tooling too early. Like my go-to initial thing for threat modeling is a whiteboard, because it's simple. Is it scalable? Not at all. Automate? Can you automate? Nope, not at all. But is it a great teaching tool? Yes, because people can come up and add things to it as we go through, and you could do it in a virtual environment as well. But I want the first threat model to be a living document that people are contributing to pieces of it, and they're making modifications to it, and they're understanding, like, as we add a single piece, how does that, we can talk about how that piece changes the things we have to think about. So I would say that's another mistake. Other mistakes. One of my favorite ones of all time is trying to get too fancy or too complex too early. And to, to set the context for that, I have to tell my love relationship with the STRIDE methodology: spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, elevation of privilege. So it's a great mnemonic and it's a starting point into threat modeling. So my mistake that I made there was, in the early days of teaching people threat modeling, STRIDE was relatively brand new when I was starting this journey that I'm on. And so I would show people STRIDE, explain it to them. We'd use it as a mnemonic, as a way to understand these are the categories of threats. They would get value from it. But then I got too fancy and I said, this STRIDE thing is just too simple. It's too easy. People know this stuff already. And I started using other methodologies to teach threat modeling, other categorizations of threats that were a lot more complicated. You know what happened? People couldn't figure out what the heck I was talking about because it was just too broad and there were too many options for them to choose from. And so then I'm back now to STRIDE as my initial teaching tool because it has that simplicity. So that was a mistake that I personally made, is I got too complicated and too complex while trying to get people revved up and excited to do the threat modeling process. And it ended up causing challenges because people were like, I don't know what you're talking about. This is too complicated. So I went back to STRIDE, and that's where I still sit today. I think that's the best tool to use to teach people threat modeling on their first few days of doing it. Now, if you're only using STRIDE 6 months later, we got other problems like that. You have to refine your threat modeling process, and the things that you use as inputs have to get more complicated as you understand how this comes together. But on day one, STRIDE is where it's at.
Okay, good. That makes a lot of sense. Um, how does starting small with a threat modeling program align with this concept of moving towards security by design?
Yeah, I think to truly achieve security by design, you have to integrate threat modeling across everything that you build. So to start, which that doesn't sound like starting small. That sounds like wanting the universe to be in the threat modeling process. But security by design is a series of small, to get to true security by design, it's a series of small conversations that build up to something gigantic. And what I mean by those small conversations is, if we want to get to security by design, we need to threat model and consider requirements at the user story or feature level. And that's a relatively small unit of work that exists inside of most companies today. They're using something that's a small unit of work. True security by design is when we consider security and privacy both in each of those small units of work. Because if we consider them over in each of those small units over time, 6 months, a year from now, we've considered the security, and we can even extend to privacy, of a lot of different pieces that are now boiling up into one complete system. And so that's how I think you start small, though, is you can't go after the entire product on the first day. You just have to figure out, how do we integrate into the smallest unit of work that's occurring here? And over time, our percentage will start to rise until we'll get to 100%, as long as we continuously do that threat modeling process at the smallest units of work.
Great. Well, thanks, Chris. I really enjoyed our time today. And feel free to ask us questions in the podcast. You can add your questions in there, and check out securitycompass.com. There's lots of good resources for you there. And there's also a free version of Devici that you can go in and try, which is our threat modeling solution that Chris developed. So thanks very much. Have a great day.